This is a story about Marie and John and their children, Joe and Linda. And whilst they are a fictional family, their story is all too real for far too many families living in New Zealand. John is violent to Marie. He beats, threatens, and humiliates her. He controls her. Our solution for Marie is refuge. But it is my firm belief that refuge is fundamentally the wrong model for us to be using in response to violence against women in New Zealand today. I'll explain why, but first it helps to understand how we got here. In 1973, Rosemary Howard and Diane Shannon became the public faces of a group of radical feminist women who took a stand to stop violence against women by co-founding New Zealand's first refuge. It was called Christchurch Women's Refuge. At the time, many New Zealanders, including some pretty powerful people, actively resisted the call for violence against women to be recognised as a significant social injustice. Instead, these people preferred the problem to remain behind closed doors. In the following years, what became known as the refuge movement coalesced. Women organised, marched, and protested. More refuges were founded. By 2009, there were 50 refuges in towns and cities around the country. Since 1973, refuges have sheltered and supported thousands of women and children. And still today, refuge symbolises our mainstream response to violence against women. So why do I believe the refuge model isn't working for us? Well, far from achieving our founders' vision, New Zealand today has the highest reported rate of intimate partner violence in the developed world. Last year, New Zealand police investigated almost 120,000 reports of domestic violence. It's estimated that about another 500,000 went unreported. Half of New Zealand's homicides are carried out by a family member. Doing more of what we've always done is not going to change this. Building more refuges is not going to change this. 6 years ago, I became chief executive at Christchurch Women's Refuge. As you know, today we're called Aviva. And I have been spending the past 6 years coming to understand why the refuge model isn't working. The vast majority of women who are experiencing violence today will never call refuge. One reason for this is that domestic violence is a form of entrapment. Let's come back to Marie and John, but first I would like to acknowledge the violence that takes place in same-sex relationships, male and female, and that straight men can experience violence from a female partner. I'd also like to acknowledge that not all violence within families is intimate partner violence. Children can be violent to their parents and siblings to each other. But I'm telling Marie's and John's story today because the majority of domestic violence in New Zealand is perpetrated against women by a heterosexual partner. When John starts to suspect that Marie may be thinking of leaving, he threatens more violence, not only against Marie, but also the children, her parents, even himself. Anything to stop her from going anywhere. Next, John is apologetic, generous, and affectionate. He talks emotionally about how much he loves Marie and the children, of how he could not live without them, of how she could not live without him. Marie doubts her judgment. She feels guilt and a strong sense of responsibility to keep the family together. She stays. Soon, John is violent again. When he thinks Marie may be thinking about leaving, he threatens more violence. His violence escalates. He repeats these behaviours, sometimes in front of the children, until it becomes a sustained pattern of abuse. Marie becomes isolated, shamed, and dependent. Almost half of New Zealand's intimate partner homicides happen at the time of actual or intended separation. Marie's entrapped. If we were to ask Marie, why do you stay? Her answer will be simple: I have no choice. But in the public narrative about domestic violence, this question is still front and center. Why does she stay? Because refuge is still our front and center response to domestic violence, we collectively reason that Marie can leave, and therefore she should leave. When we do this, we start to make Marie responsible for stopping the violence. And if she doesn't leave, we start to blame her for the violence, just like John. Now, everyone is nicely insulated from any responsibility to stop the violence. I'm insulated, you're insulated, and John is insulated. Why else don't the vast majority of women in New Zealand who experience domestic violence ever call refuge? When we explored this question in 2013, women told us that they wouldn't reach out to refuge because they found it shaming and stigmatizing, that they didn't identify with the concept of refuge or the word victim. Because shaming language stops us from reaching out for help, it sustains the social isolation that keeps us vulnerable to violence, vulnerable to experiencing violence and using violence. This makes our language part of the problem. Nonetheless, victim and refuge are the most common words in New Zealand's domestic violence language. Another common word is perpetrator. It's our short term for people like John. Like victim, this word defines a person by their behaviours rather than their human potential. Once again, shaming words stop us from connecting with the hearts and minds of the vast majority of men who are using violence. Using our words, people using violence instead of perpetrator does not minimize a person's responsibility for their violent behaviors, but it does see and talk to their human potential to become safe. Shame keeps violence behind closed doors. Many men who use violence don't actually identify as perpetrators. Many identify as victims. Many men have told us that shame, fear, and admitting they have a problem is the hardest thing to do. Though we say it's okay to ask for help, most men won't find it if they do. As a result of the sustained focus on refuge and the implied and real responsibilities this places on women to take action to stop the violence, we have invested little to nothing in innovative services for men who are using or at risk of using violence. Services that are de-shaming, engage men early, are hopeful and effective. Our focus on refuge also means that we have overlooked the place where the vast majority of violence against women and children actually takes place, our homes. Throughout John's abuse, Marie believes that her only option is refuge. She believes that in order to become safe, she must leave home, leave John, remove the kids from school, maybe even become homeless. As a result, she and the children experience many years of abuse behind closed doors. Let's remember, this is precisely where the original opponents of Christchurch Women's Refuge wanted the problem to stay, wanted Marie to stay. But what if Marie decided to take the risk and leave anyway? Well, as we know, Marie and John have 2 children. Linda is 8 and Joe is 12. Joe is a boy. Boys who are 11 or older are not allowed in many refuges. This reflects a perspective that women and girls in refuge will feel unsafe around Joe because he is an adolescent boy. From Joe's perspective, he is being blamed for his father's behavior. But Joe's exclusion from refuge isn't the only reason why it's not working for Marie. Over the years, alcohol has become her friend, helping her to manage her fear and anxiety. And whilst this is not at all uncommon for women who are experiencing abuse, it does significantly increase their vulnerability to violence. Nonetheless, women with multiple issues, domestic violence, alcohol misuse, mental ill health, are commonly excluded from refuge. We describe these women as challenging. So there we go again with our victim blaming. We have failed to develop effective alternatives for women and men with multiple issues, and then we make them the problem. Refuge was a very significant development in New Zealand in 1973 for women already experiencing violence. And please hear me when I say this now, it remains an important social service today. The problem is we simply haven't evolved or kept pace with contemporary social values. Whilst today, I believe we would all agree it is not okay for Joe to have to leave school because he's being bullied by another pupil. It seems it is okay for him to have to leave home with his mum and his sister because they are experiencing domestic violence. New Zealand prides itself on being the first country in the world to grant women the vote. And although this happened way back in 1893, we still talk about it lots. It symbolises our national identity as a fair and progressive society. Yet, as Kate Shepherd campaigned for suffrage, the process of colonisation was laying the grounds for generations of social, cultural, and economic inequalities for Māori. Today, Māori are more than twice as likely to experience intimate partner violence. Māori children are 6 times more likely to die of child abuse or neglect. The suicide rate amongst young Māori men is 2.5 times that of their non-Māori counterparts. But this is not about being Māori. It's about the enduring effects of violence, the enduring intergenerational effects of colonisation. In 1973, the foundation of Christchurch Women's Refuge symbolised the emergence of a social movement to build a fairer New Zealand, free from all forms of oppression, not only violence against women. As the number of refuges grew, what was known as the Women's Liberation Movement became known as the Refuge Movement. And so I wonder if this was when our vision shifted from liberation to protection, from a struggle for equality to a struggle for funding. This is why, as a feminist, I believe the concept of refuge in contemporary New Zealand society is paradoxical and unjust. Women are not intrinsically vulnerable to violence. Vulnerability to violence is the consequence of extrinsic inequalities. Remove these, and we remove the need for protection. I passionately believe that ending violence against women and children in New Zealand is fully achievable. So how do we get back on track? Let's imagine we begin by changing our mindset, from believing that women need protection to believing in everyone's potential to become a great parent, a great partner, a great citizen, if offered the right support at the right time, in the right way. Imagine if we shifted our focus from refuge to homes, from individuals to families, to sooner rather than later. Imagine if we provided support for all members of your family: children, young people, women and men, people experiencing violence, people using violence, and people with experiences of both. Imagine if children came first. Imagine if we changed our attitude. It's not your responsibility to reach out to us, it's ours to reach out to you. And if a service we're providing is not working, we ask you how we could improve rather than question your motivation and commitment. Imagine if you could get all the support you need through one very welcoming front door. Support with all forms of domestic violence and mental health problems, drug and alcohol problems, housing, employment, microfinance, support with your kids. Imagine if every home in New Zealand was safe. This is the approach Aviva is taking. Since 2011, we have been reimagining and transforming what it looks like to support families and end violence. But we're going to have to be honest with each other. We are not going to achieve this vision unless we commit together to ending the inequality drivers of New Zealand's violence, social, cultural, and economic. And this is not only Aviva's role, it's all of ours, community, political, and bureaucratic. I first visited New Zealand in 2005. I came for a mental health conference and was really struck by the number of presenters who talked about aroha, who talked about love. Aroha seemed to have much more power, depth and authenticity than the professionalized notion of compassion and empathy I was trained and bound to practice in my first trade as a nurse. Aroha seemed to talk to acceptance of others, self-awareness, the power of vulnerability and mutual responsibility. It's why I came back to New Zealand. It's why I'm here. Imagine if we brought aroha to overcoming New Zealand's violence. Imagine if we brought love. So for every family in New Zealand today and tomorrow, ki te haere ki te tihi, we can ascend this summit. Thank you.